Continuing our reading in Yellow Eyes by Rutherford Montgomery, Chapter 3, Captured. Cougar George, the human, sloshed through the dew-laden grass at a rapid walk. He had breakfasted well and was eager to see if he had made a catch. He was aware that he might have to make another set. If the first kitten inside the trap sprang it, he would have to set it again. Then, too, there was the possibility of other animals visiting the set. He was not afraid of wolves or coyotes that first night, but other marauders might happen along. At his heels capered 7 hounds. They were just a few months short of being full grown, and this accounted for their lack of serious demeanor. They had not attained that maturity which brings a sad aspect to the lion hound. Cougar George stood out of the aspens and into the meadow where the set had been made. He halted and called to the dogs, then his eyes took in the trap and its catch. He gave a wild whoop. He had made a clean catch, 3 cats in one trap. This must be the whole litter, for one more would have been a large family. Leaping forward, with the hounds bounding ahead, he approached the trap for a closer inspection. With a fury of howling, the hounds charged the trap. Behind the bars, Yellow Eyes rose from the cramped position he had held since daylight reddened the eastern sky. Fuzzy hurriedly backed into a corner and hissed defiance. Runty leaped into the air, but there was no friendly bow for him to fasten upon, and he fell back across the carcass of the buck. Cougar George kicked the eager dogs back and produced a heavy canvas sack. "I can pack you all up in one trip," he exulted as he opened the sack. Grinning broadly, he slipped on a pair of heavy leather gloves. Yellow Eyes stood his ground just inside the bars, hissing and slashing at the eager muzzles the hounds thrust between the saplings. "Get back, you hounds!" Cougar George bellowed. "We gotta save these cats for some fun at the cabin. You can't claw 'em up right here. I promised the boys from the road gang a real fuss." Carefully, he lifted the drop log until it was high enough for him to crawl under. Arming himself with a heavy aspen limb, he squeezed through. As his shoulders thrust through the opening, Yellow Eyes leaped straight at his face. Cougar swung his club and landed a crushing blow across the little cat's head and shoulders. Yellow Eyes went down, knocked out cold. "Eat you will, you little devil," Cougar George snarled. "I'll show you." With a jerk, he hauled the limp Yellow Eyes forward and shoved him into the sack. The capture of Fuzzy was only a matter of getting a grip on the squirming and biting kitten. He put up a furious struggle, but in less than a minute, he was squirming on top of the still form of Yellow Eyes at the bottom of the stout sack. Runty joined his brother in the smothering darkness of the sack in a short order, and Cougar George tied a buck hide thong around the top of the sack. The hounds were making a terrible uproar outside, and Cougar George could not silence them. They were getting their first hot scent of mountain lion, and they liked it. As Cougar George hacked free of the trap, they leaped at the sack, and he had to beat them off. The trip back to the cabin was slow, for the sack was heavy and hard to carry. The dogs had to be beaten off every so often, and the hunter was forced to rest at regular intervals. It was afternoon when he reached the cabin, tired but elated. He dumped the sack at his back door and kicked one of the hounds a jarring blow to the ribs. "Get back and lie down," he shouted. The kicked hound retreated and lay down where he could watch the sack. Every time it bobbed up and down, he growled eagerly. The other dogs had gone in search of a drink. Cougar George's cabin had been built close to a steep hill. A cellar had been dug into the hillside. The dugout was faced with sandstone heavily chinked with mud. This was the intended prison for the cats. Its door lifted straight up, and it would be easy to liberate one cougar at a time for the dogs. Thick aspen timbers surrounded the cabin, which would make the chase great sport. but still offer small chance of one of the little varmints making his escape. The dogs would be given a close start and would take care of that. If one of the three shinnied up a sapling, he could easily be shaken down into the waiting jaws of the hounds. Cougar George was very much pleased with his plan. This was a rare chance to start his dogs right. He had been resting in front of the cabin. Now he got up and dragged the sack to the cellar door. A heavy rope with a bushy knot at the end served as a lift for the door. Cougar George pulled the rope, and the door swung upward easily. Yanking the sack into the dusk of the cellar, he began fumbling at the buck-hide knot. When the string was loose, he kicked the sack into the deeper gloom of the back of the cellar. Pulling the door down from the inside, he caught the bottom of the sack and shook it. There was a hissing and scrambling. Light from a square hole above the door gave illumination enough to show two pair of eyes glowing in the back of the cellar. There was a chorus of snarls, then the eyes dashed past him, and he could hear the little cougars leaping about the cellar trying to get out. Hey, he bellowed. Get back into the corner. Beating the air with his empty sack, he stomped his feet. His words had the desired effect. There was a scurrying of little pads, and two pair of yellow eyes glowed at him from the back of the cellar. Darn shame I hit the big one too hard. Cougar George growled as he backed out of the cellar. I must have killed him dead or crippled him. There's only 4 eyes back there. He backed carefully out of the cellar, lifting the door only enough to allow him to retreat. At the door, he halted and reached down to pick up a bundle of hides and a pair of boots he had stored in the cellar. Better drag that truck outside or them varmints might chew it up. He bent over, keeping a wary eye on the flames at the back of the cellar. With a toss, he dumped the bundle against the wall outside. He had need to be quick, for one pair of eyes shot toward him, and he felt a furry body jar against the heavy door as it slid into place. Whistling to his hounds, he set off toward the spot where a government road gang was making a trail across the wilderness. He had promised the boys a show, and he meant to put it on as soon as he could return with his guests. At the road camp, he found 10 men. 2 of them did not care to see a cougar killed by a pack of dogs, but the other 8 were eager to join the sport. Cougar had his hounds with him, and the troop started back with the dogs out ahead. Inside the cellar, 2 little cougars were smelling about uneasily. The darkness and the smell of sandstone was reassuring, but the lack of an opening through which they could squeeze made them uneasy. With low, plaintive cries, they called for their mother, not knowing that her pelt was drying 20 feet from where they were held prisoners. If there ever was a time when they needed and wanted her, it was now. When she did not answer, they kept on calling and running around the cellar, bumping into each other and spitting. Finally, they lay down close to the door with their pink noses jammed against a crack that let in fresh air and a crack of light. Presently, a distant howling came to them, and the shouting of a number of men. They whined a little, but lay still. Surely their enemies could not find them in this cave. There was no way to get in or out that they had been able to get out. Their mother had always hidden them in a dark cave in the daytime, and that had been safe. Still, the sounds came closer and grew nearer and louder. Outside, the door to the sun was beating upon the pile of dry leaves, an old coat, several pairs of worn old wool socks, and a rubber boot. Below the cabin at the edge of the clearing, the hounds appeared, followed by the men. The dogs were running back and forth and howling with suppressed energy and eagerness. The rubber boot against the wall stirred and slid to the ground. It wiggled grotesquely and straightened out. From its mouth a spiked tail protruded, then a furry rump, and at last a cougar kitten. Runty blinked and looked around. The air in the boot had grown smotheringly hot. He had clawed his way further into the hole than was comfortable. He had been ready to dash into any hideaway when he had tumbled from the sack. He was groggy and sick from so much confinement. Across the clearing came the men and the dogs. Cougar George had been too eager to follow the pathway which led around the hill. He was pointing out the cellar and telling the men the general plan for releasing the little cougars. The dogs had fallen silent for a minute. The party was only 100 yards from the cabin and all set for the fun. From a patch of rose briar directly ahead of them leaped a cottontail rabbit. He had wandered out into the clearing and, after filling his little belly with grass and tender roots, had lain down to sleep. The hounds sighted him and broke forth in a chorus of howls. Green and untrained, they gave chase, while the bunny streaked for cover in a high ledge of rock which came down to the clearing. Cougar swore loudly in an attempt to call the dogs back. At last he turned to the men with a beaten grin that hid some of the chagrin and wrath he felt. Them dogs has a lot to learn. That's one reason I aim to pull this cat killing. That rabbit'll run plumb away from them, and then they'll come sneaking back. He turned toward the cabin as he spoke. Runty shook his head a couple of times and sneezed. Suddenly a terrible chorus of howls burst upon his ears. The dogs, which had scared him so terribly while he was out in the aspen trap, were coming. He could see them leaping through the tall grass. He looked wildly around for a sapling to shin up, or for a friendly overhanging branch to leap to. Above his head dangled a rope with a shaggy knot at the end. With a hissing snarl, Runty leaped upward and fastened upon the shaggy knot. To his surprise and fright, the rope began to descend toward the ground under his weight. He tried to shin up further, but could not get past the knot. The cellar door lifted a foot, and two furry heads popped out. Yellow Eyes was the first out into the sunshine, but Fuzzy was close upon his heels. They almost ran over Runty, who was sitting on the ground with the rope knot clasped to his round belly. Yellow Eyes slapped the youngster free of the rope and led a bounding dash for the heavy timber above the cabin. Cougar George was not 100 feet from the cellar when the little cougars burst out, but he had left his rifle in the cabin, and he carried no 6-gun. His hounds were hot on the trail of a bunny. Cursing wildly, he gave chase on foot, which got him past the cabin and in a position to see the 3 kittens dash into the thick underbrush, with Yellow Eyes setting the pace. That's the end of chapter 3.